All right, so y'all, have you been dismissed before? Like you're going to be dismissed in about maybe 40 minutes or so. And most of you are going to be glad that you're going to be dismissed. Maybe you get to go see the kids and find out how the frog pond was, or you get to talk to a friend that you haven't talked to in a week or so. Some of you are going to be happy you're dismissed because you get to go outside and it's going to be like beautiful today. So, some dismissals, kids that come to school here when class is over, they're dismissed and they're usually happy about that. Like, very few of them stick around and like, teacher, can you just, talk about chemistry a little bit more and let us, sit and soak and just marinate in these words. Now, some dismissals, though, aren't nearly as good, are they? Like, some of us we've been actually dismissed because of what we look like. We've been dismissed because of the people that we hang out with. We've been dismissed because of something that we've believed or we don't believe. We've been dismissed, and in that type of dismissal, it just doesn't feel very good. Now, the text that Brooke just read a little bit ago, we can see that Jesus was dismissed in this text. He was dismissed by these soldiers who were right below him. And just like those times when we're dismissed, for who we are, for what we believe, for who we hang out with, for what we've done, that couldn't have felt good to Jesus. Now, Jesus, let's assume that he was trying to look down at these guys. I don't think that Jesus would have had a very clear picture of who they were. He had gone through so much pain and so much agony. And I think even like physically, it would have been very difficult, as I've read these stories, it would have been very difficult to even see them for Jesus because we know that Jesus would have been bloody. We know that he would have been sweaty. We know that his hands were out here. This blood and this sweat would have had to been getting in his eyes, and it would have been very difficult for him to see. And it was for Jesus, it was the most painful. It was the most lonely. It was the most desperate moment of his life, or anyone else's life for that matter. And as he hung there on the cross, we think it was probably for about 6 hours or so. I wonder, what is it that Jesus actually saw? What is it that Jesus actually heard? What is it that Jesus actually experienced? Now, that's what we're going to be looking at for the next 6 weeks. Is we're going to be looking at different people's reaction to the dying Jesus. What Jesus witnessed in part on that day was men and women who were answering the question, whether they realized they were answering it or not, this essential question that all of us have to respond to as well in life. And the question is very simple, but there's nothing more profound. The question is, what is it that we're going to do with Jesus? What is it that we're going to do with Jesus? Now, today we're going to look at these soldiers, and we're going to look at their reply, their response to the question, what is it that we're going to do with Jesus? Now, it was most likely the soldiers who were the first people to see Jesus who were nailed to the cross. They were there. They were the ones who did it. They were the ones that sat below the cross when all this was going down. And as Jesus, maybe he struggled to look down. Maybe he could see it through the blood. Maybe he could see it through the sweat. Maybe he could see it through the eyes that had to be irritated. It's amazing. It is absolutely amazing what these soldiers were doing. What the Bible, talks about what they're doing. They were gambling. They were playing a game. Here's Jesus dying on a cross. There's one guy on each of his sides, and these guys have become so numb to the experience of death. They were down there gambling. Who would get to keep Jesus' T-shirt? It's the most significant event in human history. And they were completely oblivious. The Son of God is dying above them, and they're playing games. Now, somehow they missed out on the good news that the one above them who is dying is the one who can change everything, the one who has changed everything, the one who can still change everything. The question that they had to respond to, and they weren't specifically asked it, but they responded to it, is, what will you do with Jesus? Now, familiarity was their main enemy. They had seen this all before. They had been there. They had done that. Like today, like when someone is put to death, we read about this. In the states that it's legal, even when the death penalty happens, you hear about it in the news. You hear about it in the paper the next day at 9:46 a.m. So-and-so was injected with fluids, and he died 3 minutes later. He was the one who 7 years ago killed these 6 people. It's news. Today when it happens, it's news. It's legal in some places, but it rarely happens. It's news. But in this culture, it was normal. Death was a common punishment for criminals. And these guys were familiar with it as something, they'd seen it before. They'd almost become like numb to it. And as we read in John chapter 19, verses 23 and 24, when the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes. Okay, so Jesus is hanging up on the cross. They took his clothes. They divided them into 4 shares, one for each of them. Now with the remaining undergarment, now what this most likely was a t-shirt, probably without sleeves. It would have been a t-shirt that would have come down to about his knees or so. The garment would have been, and what the Bible says is the garment was seamless, woven into one piece from top to bottom. And then they said, let's not tear it. They said to one another, let's decide by lot who will get it. So Jesus is up there dying, and these guys are below him, basically gambling on who is going to get this garment. This happened to be the scripture that fulfilled, which said, they divided my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Now, are y'all familiar with the law of familiarity? I think this is something that most of us deal with at least some of the time. The law of familiarity would probably go something like this. No matter how valuable something is, so just think about some things in your life, no matter how valuable something is over time, there's this danger that we're going to take it for granted because we're familiar with it. So I want you to actually apply that to your lives and think about what that might look like in a relationship that you have. We get familiar with our kids, we get familiar with our spouse, we get familiar with our friends. And then there's this danger that over time, we take this for granted, or maybe like your physical health. Most of us here this morning are fairly healthy physically, aren't we? I think that many of us probably take that for granted. When's the last time we've actually prayed, God, I just thank you that I'm healthy. I feel good most of the time, and I just want to thank you for blessing me in that way. Now the minute that all of a sudden that health is threatened, then we realize we've been taking it for granted. Our world can absolutely turn upside down. The reason I talk about this is because this has profound implications for our spiritual life. You've heard these stories before. The story that I'm going to tell in 6 weeks on Easter Sunday, I'm going to give you a hint of what I'm going to talk about. It's going to be the exact same thing as it was last year. It's the same story. The story doesn't change. Jesus was killed. It was a brutal death. It was terrible. Jesus was in a tomb for 3 days, and on the 3rd day, he rose from the dead. And because he has risen from the dead, each of us can rise from the dead as well. Now, I think the danger becomes that the story is so familiar that we can lose the power of this story in its familiarity. Now listen to what happened in Matthew 27, verses 35 through 36. This is a little bit different version. When they crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Now, this was so familiar to these people that they didn't even realize that this man was different than all other men. They didn't realize that the one that they had killed could actually forgive them of their sins. They knew that it was a matter of time before this man's breathing would become more spasmodic, and that his life would ebb away, and they would go home and they would have dinner. Now I'll say for us, I think that many of us, that this story of Jesus is just too familiar to us. We've heard this too many times. The kids in Sunday school, they're hearing this story right now. If you grew up in a church, you've heard this story before. Maybe you're in Bible school, or you went to some kind of camp and you heard the story. Maybe there's a time as an adult you got active in the church again. You keep hearing the story, and all of a sudden it's just so familiar that it loses its power. I was reminded of this. I was a youth minister in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've been thinking this week, like, we discovered this familiarity, and this familiarity breeds indifference. And we were watching a movie, and it was called The Jesus Film. Now, there's been a couple of them out since then. This was like back in 1998, 1999. The original Jesus film, like in 2004, there was the Passion of the Christ with Mel Gibson, and in 2014, there's a new one that's out now as well. And this was the original Jesus movie. Now, this church, it was a very eclectic church. We were kind of on some borders, and on one side, there was a very educated, affluent group of people. Another side was kind of like a blue-collar crowd. The other side of the church was like this artistic crowd. And it was a wonderful church. I mean, it was what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like. Just a diverse collection of individuals seeking to know God more together, serving together. It was wonderful. And as a youth minister there, it was sometimes challenging, but one of the things I loved, they let me go to the schools, and I'd meet some kids, and we'd just bring some kids in that didn't have any kind of church history, and we'd merge them with a diverse group of people that had a church history. And we were showing this Jesus movie one night, or the Jesus film, and it was so cool for me to look at the different responses that different people had. The kids and the adults in the church who had seen this movie before, they had heard this story before, their reaction was a little bit different than those who were brand new. There's one kid, his name was Scott. I think Scott was probably about 16 or 17 when this happened, and Scott was totally new to church. The first church that he had ever been into was St. Andrew United Methodist Church. I think he had been around for probably about 2 or 3 months, and he watched this movie, and he came up to me after the movie, and he was not familiar with the story, and he was mad. Scott was angry. And like I said, this is what it's supposed to be like. We're supposed to hear this, and we're supposed to get angry. But sometimes our familiarity has bred indifference, and we don't get that anger. Because this innocent man was killed for something that he didn't do. And if I would tell you a parable about something that happened today, you'd get mad. Because it's the first time you've heard the story. But we've heard this story. And there was another woman. She was new. She was a volunteer, and we had her kind of doing some logistical stuff for us. And she hadn't heard this story before. Or maybe she had heard the story so long ago she had forgotten it. And I looked over her, and I could see that she was visibly like shaken by this film because she wasn't familiar. Now, many of us, we grew up in the church, and like last week, like we sang the song "Amazing Grace." Now, if you've been in the church very long, you've sung that song many. I don't care if it's a new church, a modern church, a traditional church, a formal church. That's a song that we sing. But I wonder, like, for a song like that, if it's become so familiar that it's lost some of its power. Just think of the amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Is it sweet? When I say that word grace, is it sweet? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. There are power in those words. There's also familiarity in the words. And if there's so much familiarity in the words, the power from the words are lost. We prayed the Lord's Prayer a little bit ago. Now, if you've been in this church if you've been in this church for like 5 years, you've prayed that prayer at least 250 times. Is it the motions that we're going through? Or do these words have power? If there's any words that have ever been spoken that have power, it's these words. Lord, forgive me of my trespasses. Give me this day my daily bread. Lead me away from temptation. There's power. There is power in those words. But I wonder if some of us are like those soldiers below the cross, and this has become so familiar that it's become predictable. Now, if this is you, or if this is something you at least struggle with a little bit, I just want you to, over these next 6 weeks, Jesus tells us in another place, he says, become like a child. Jesus says, what you need to do is you need to become like a child. And Look at these stories through the eyes of a child as someone who has never heard these stories before. Just throw away some of our presuppositions, throw away some of our history, and just say, I'm a new person this year, and God is going to speak something new to me this year. I'm going to look at this through the eyes of a child this year. And I really believe that we're going to see something different. I believe that we're going to hear something different. I believe that we'll experience something different. So familiarity is the first issue that we may deal with as we deal with this most important question: what are we going to do with Jesus? Now, the next stumbling block that we can face is the stumbling block of prejudice. Now, prejudice can make us do terrible things. You've been around long enough to know that prejudice can make us do terrible things. When I was in college, I went to Drake University. I grew up in a small town in northwest Iowa, and most of the students who go to Drake are from Chicago. Some are from Minneapolis, some are from Milwaukee, some will be from Kansas City, some come from Omaha, but most are from Chicago. I took some friends from Chicago. There's actually one of them who was from Milwaukee. They all wanted to see a farm. They've never seen a working farm before, and I can help you out with that. So we're 2 or 3 months into this thing. It's October, November, and I take them to this little town that I grew up in. It's a town of about 1,000 people or so. They saw the pigs, they saw the cattle, they saw the corn, they saw the beans, they saw the tractors, they saw the mud, they smelled the corn, they smelled the pigs, and the novelty wore off really quickly. But it was really cool to see my friends experience a small town. And I'd been to Chicago with some of them, and it was amazing how different the worlds were that we grew up in. And we went downtown that Saturday night. Now when I say downtown, okay, it's bordered by a grain elevator on one side and a school on the other. You got 3 bars, a bowling alley, and a pizza place. Since we were 18 years old, you can get a 40% chance of which of the 5 places that we went to. Now, I didn't even think anything of this. One of the girls or women that came with me, she was from Chicago, but her family was Filipino. Now, where I grew up, it's not this way anymore, but in the 1980s, the town was 100% white. 1,000 people lived there, 1,000 people were white, no exceptions. In fact, if you were not a Norwegian, you were a really weird person. If you're German or Irish or Danish or something like that, you were a second-class citizen. So we're sitting having pizza, and one of the guys from the town, I knew who he was. I didn't really know him that well, but you're from a small town, you know everybody. All of a sudden, he started using words that I would have never used to describe another human being. Her boyfriend, put his arm around her. I looked at her face, and she was doing absolutely everything that she could do not to cry. He got his pizza, he left, and I was I'm sorry. And she said, it's okay. I said, no, it's not okay. Nobody should ever be treated like that. Based upon the color of your skin, based upon what you believe, based upon who you hang out with. That's not the way that people treat people. This girl just came to see some cows and some pigs and some corn. And she experienced prejudice. Now, prejudice happened in this story as well. Palestine was under Roman occupation at the time. So the Italians, the Romans, they did not like the Palestinians. And the Palestinians returned the favor, and they didn't like the Romans. The Romans were the ones who were in power. So the Palestinians pretty much had to behave, or their sentence was going to be pretty much the same as Jesus. A Roman would have hated being stationed in Palestine. There's Greece, and there's Italy, and there's Spain, and there's all these other places, but to go all the way over here, this is the worst. So they're dealing with that. There's constant fighting among the two. There was name calling, there was ridicule, there was racial slurs. Now, even some of the Jewish zealots would have carried knives around with them. And if a Roman soldier would have ever gotten off alone by himself, they would have done their best to kill the person. That's why the Roman soldiers always traveled in groups of at least 2 or 3. Now, chances are, these Roman soldiers look up on the cross, and they see a Jewish man. And this doesn't bother them at all, because of the prejudice and the hatred that they had toward another ethnic group of people. Now, I think that for some of us that we experience some prejudice against Christ because we have experienced some negativity by some of his followers. You know, maybe like there was a day that you left church with just such a bad taste in your mouth. You say, this whole church thing, I just don't know if it's for me. You know, maybe there was a day that you saw someone with a bumper sticker, honk if you love Jesus. You know, he's yelling at his kids. You know, maybe there's some prejudice against God because we've seen the church at its worst. Now, the church at its best, and it's part of our mission, it's part of our values, like, we're here to bring people into a closer relationship with God. But the church hasn't always been that way. Now, some of you used to know me when knew me when I'd run marathons, and I think this was like it wasn't that long ago, 2007 or 2008, I ran the rock and roll marathon down in Phoenix. Just this beautiful place, January, perfect weather. Right before the race, I met a guy named Paul. And Paul and I were going to run the race together. We both kind of had the same time goal. It said, let's just start off. And so we talked, and we're standing next to each other. We start, go off. About 2 miles into the race, there's this church that's basically picketing the race. They got these great big signs that says, repent and turn of your sins. Sundays are for church. The next one is, basically they were just like telling us we're going to hell because we're running a marathon on Sunday. And like after about 2 or 3 signs, Paul didn't exactly use these words, but I'll like paraphrase it. He says, I hope we don't have to listen to this stuff the whole way. I said, yeah, I hope so too. And you run with someone like we're an hour into the race, and we're kind of talking a little bit, and what do you do? And he's like a rowing coach somewhere. He says, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a pastor. He says, well, I hope I didn't offend you back there. And I said, oh, no, they're not with me. So, if my church was in Phoenix, this would be the type of people that would, hand out water bottles at mile 20 and, rub our feet when we're done. And, that's the type of people we are. And but just think about that, though. Like, there's 20,000 people doing that race. And every single one of them saw this. And do you seriously think that helped them grow in their relationship with God? There's a friend of mine, I've known him for like 8 or 9 years now, and he called me up a few years ago, and there was kind of a break in our relationship. We used to talk a lot and hang out some, and then, we kind of took a couple years off, nothing major, just, life got in the way. And when people call me up, and I haven't heard from them for a few years, I know like one of 2 things has usually happened. Either they're in a bunch of trouble, or they've gotten engaged. And thankfully, in his case, he got engaged. And so, one of the things about him is he's an agnostic, and so I always loved talking with him and stuff like that. And he said, can you do our wedding? And I was like looking at the calendar, and I said, yeah, it looks like the day's free. I said, well, I'm kind of curious. So, I'm a pastor, and I am going to read the Bible. I'm going to pray. I'm not going to water this down. I just don't do that. And he says, no, we want you to do a Christian wedding. And I said, oh, is your wife, is she a Christian or something? And, oh, no, she's an atheist. I said, well, are you like a Christian? Are you still an agnostic? He goes, no, I'm an atheist too now. She's converted me. And she's converted you to what? So then we started talking. I said, I'm happy to do this. I know you, I love you, we're friends. But I'm just curious, why is it that you want me to do your wedding? Judges can do this, or I know a radio talk show host that can do this. I can hook you up with him. And he says, well, there's 15,000 reasons. Her parents are going to pay for the wedding if it's a Christian service. All right, well, my price just doubled. So then I met with him a few weeks later, and he called me up and says, hey, can you meet us down Dundee or something like that and have dinner? And I was like, well, I usually don't go east of 168th Street, but I guess we could do it this one time. So we're talking to him, and she's like, does it bother you that I'm an atheist? And I was like, let's just talk about that. What is it that happened? Have you always been this? And she goes, no, I grew up in Wisconsin, and I went to a Lutheran school, from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And then she just poured out her heart. I'd never met this woman before. Like she was saying, like they were just so strict, and it was just all about rules. And I'm not picking on a denomination. I think the school is probably an exception to the rule. And like, she was just saying, like, I would see like the teachers out in the community, and they're teaching us one thing and they're doing something else, and it was so strict and so stringent. And the day I graduated from that school, I knew that I was never going to go back to the church again. So I was like, well, I don't know if it's God you have the problem with. I think it's the reflection of God that this school has put out that has really been an issue for you. She kind of thought about it for a second, and she said, yeah, I guess you might be right. I said, well, here's the deal. I'm going to do your wedding. I invite you to come to church, and they've actually been here a few times. I said, I just want you to be open. Like, just put all the baggage from behind, just put it behind you. And let's just do this thing, and let's just see how it works out. So it's really cool. At the end of the wedding, what I do is I put my hand over the hand of the couple, and I always bless them. And at the end of the blessing, I always say the Lord's Prayer. Now I got this thing memorized, so I don't need to look at my notes to do that. And as I was praying the Lord's Prayer, I looked at them, and both of them said, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So it's really cool. I saw her about a year ago, and I hadn't really talked to her much since then, just an occasional text message with my friend, and she saw me, and like she was pregnant. I never ask a woman if she's pregnant, but this woman was like 11 months pregnant, and she's pretty small to begin with. And I said, "Oh, you're with child?" And she goes, "Yeah, 2 of them." And they had the baby. They were telling me that she said, "We're going to a church now in Midtown by where we live, and it's so cool. Like the pastor, like he's so young and he's cool. Like he's younger and cooler than you are." I said, "Well, Jesus was younger and cooler than me at my current age as well, so that's a good thing." But just think about that. Like, the issue wasn't God. The issue was the church. The issue was the school. In the church, at our best, what we do is we point people to God. The church, at our worst, is we point people away from God. Now, I would say this. If any church has ever hurt you, I'd say this. If our church has hurt you, I want you to do your absolute best to put those 2 things aside and not let an imperfect group of people or an imperfect person point you away from a perfect God and a perfect person, the one who can save us from our sins, the one who can give us hope, the one who can give us help. Think about Zacchaeus. Now remember Zacchaeus, remember the little guy, he wanted to just see Jesus. And part of Zacchaeus' story is all these people were lined up on the road. There's all these people in the way of him seeing Jesus. Now, maybe in your past, there's been all these people in your way of you seeing Jesus. Now, what I want you to do and what I want us to do is be like Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus didn't say, I'm going to quit. Zacchaeus didn't say, I'm just going to let these people get in my way and I'm not going to do anything about it. What Zacchaeus did is he found a tree and he climbed it. And he saw Jesus and he had an encounter with Jesus and Jesus changed his life. That would be the second thing. I would say just get above the crowd, get to Jesus and see him. And in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God, at the throne of God." So we have familiarity as an obstacle. We have prejudice as an obstacle. And the last one we have as an obstacle is distractions. So prejudice, familiarity, and now distractions. And I would say, and we've talked about this before many times, but are any of us distracted? Yeah, we can be very distracted. Distractions can get in the way of our relationship with God. Now, so the soldiers were very preoccupied here. We go back to Matthew, they're very preoccupied, and they're preoccupied with winning Jesus' undergarment. Like the simple t-shirt that goes down to his knees. They were preoccupied with that when the life-changing event, the biggest life-changing event in human history, was happening right above them. Now I wonder how many of us are missing out on this spiritual adventure, this spiritual journey, because we're so distracted and we're so preoccupied. The soldiers said, let's not cut this up. Let's cast lots. Let's gamble for it. Let's roll the dice. Let's draw straws. And you've seen the paintings before. And during these paintings, You'll see Jesus up on the cross. Sometimes he's got the two men beside him. And you'll see the guys below him, and what are they doing? They're not looking up. They're looking down. They're looking at the dice. They're seeing who was going to win the shirt. I think there's so many distractions, whether it's investments, whether it's business, whether it's technology, whether it's a hobby, whether it's our house, whether it's our lawn, whatever it is. None of these things are evil, but many of these things are keeping us from God himself. And it's like this, I'll do this all the time. It's so easy to get distracted. I love Monday mornings. I'll get the prayer lists, and I'll put your prayer requests down, and I can pray, and I can stay focused because there's 20 things. I'm going to pray for this person's health, and I'm going to pray for this person's relationship, and I'm going to pray for this person's decision, and I can go through that list. But the other night I was praying, and I was thinking, God, this has been a great day. I had a couple challenges, and thank you for helping me out with those, and thank you for all the blessings. And the boys, they're great. David's got a basketball game, his last one on Saturday, and we're having a party afterward, and that's really cool. And then we got to get Benjamin to this place, and daylight savings time means I get an hour less sleep, and all of a sudden, my head's my calendar, and I'm not praying anymore, and it's because I'm distracted. I just think about all the ways that we can get distracted from the growth and the life that God wants us to have. Now, there was a missionary who was in China. His name was Glenn. He wrote a book about probably 30, 35 years ago about this experience, and most of it was about his Chinese experience, but there's this really cool story at the end of the book. He was actually put under house arrest. This was when China was a real hardcore communist country, and they came to him and they said, you're going to be leaving in one day. You get to pack 200 pounds worth of stuff. I had a wife and 2 kids, so they kind of went through all the stuff, and they got the best 200 pounds of all their stuff. And they got it down to the 200.0 pounds. So then the next day, think about that. If there's 3 or 4 of you in a household, or even more, how do you decide what you're going to take? And they had to do that. They had to do it quickly. The next day, the government comes. They're getting ready to take them to the airport. They said, well, since you're going to take the kids, you got to weigh them first. The 2 kids between them weighed 155 pounds. So now the 200 pounds of stuff that they could take is only 45 pounds. And he said, me and my wife, we just looked at each other. He says, this stuff, it can stay here. But the 2 sons, they have to come with us. Now, we think it would be absolutely ridiculous if we would take anything else besides our sons. But I think that some of us do that every day. We pick other stuff over the son. There's things that we waste our time with. There's things that just keep us busy to numb the reality of life. When we're like those soldiers and we're playing dice, and the Son of God is right above us, willing to forgive, willing to help us live, willing to help us grow, willing to teach us and direct us and guide us. So I'm going to close this in prayer, and I just want to pray for all of us. Maybe you found yourself in here somewhere this morning. Maybe this is just so familiar. We just do the same stuff every year. And I would just pray that let's just put everything behind us and aside us, and let's just go into this Easter with new eyes and new ears so that we can see new things and hear new things and experience new things. Some of you may have come and maybe you've been hurt by a church before. Maybe you've been hurt by this church. I would say let's be part of the solution and not be part of the problem. Let's continue as we can, the best that we can, to reflect Jesus to our community and to our world together. If there are hurts, don't let those hurts reflect upon a perfect and a loving God, because they don't. God in his essence is perfect. We as humans are imperfect, and the church can be nothing but such that, but we can get better. And then the third thing is for those of us who are distracted. Maybe there's just things we're wasting our time on. Maybe there's things that aren't productive for us. Maybe there's things that we've elevated to supreme importance that are nothing but supreme. So let us go to God and let us pray. Lord,